Hello again, Rays. It's KJ, and we're going to go with part 2 of juror number 18, Money, Power, and Sex, the Lori Vallow Daybell trial by Tom Evans. What do you think of it so far? Leave it in the comments. Let me know what you think. Sometimes you hear information and it triggers something in there to go down paths of discovery to find out something that you didn't know or something that you already knew that you could share on this channel. Okay? But let's get started again. KJ's going to do her best, okay? Chapter 4, Justice. What is justice? Why is it so important? Justice is the foundation to our freedom. Just like the foundation of a building, it is a system composed of many parts. Each part, just like the bricks or stones under a structure, serves as an important purpose. If one part fails, the whole system fails. Take the keystone out of a stone arch. The arch crumbles, and as it crumbles, everything above it crumbles. The whole building above it depends on that arch in the foundation, and without that arch, the whole building comes down. Without a good, solid, and equal justice system, our whole country will crumble. And just as a building crumbling might start slowly, once it starts coming down, it happens quickly and there's no way to stop it. That's the terrifying part about what I see happening in our country. We're beginning to crumble, and maybe we can take quick action and save ourselves. But at some point, it will be too late. Once it's too late, what will be left? What will be left at all? A pile of worthless rubble. Our system of justice in this country is basically unchanged since our forefathers set it up in the 1700s. They took the system they were familiar with, the British model, and tweaked it to make it more just, more equal, and fair to the common man. All defendants are considered innocent until proven guilty. Defendants have the right to a speedy trial and will be judged by their peers. Defendants do not have to incriminate themselves, and so on. But here we are in 2023, and I think a lot of us question whether the system is broken. Every night on the news, we see criminals running free in the streets, burning, looting, and fighting with police. We see politicians get away with all kinds of things that we as citizens would never get away with. We see crimes committed by criminals with records that should have kept them in jail. Our system of justice is the foundation to the freedom we love, and if the system is broken, boy, are we in trouble. I want to say here, just for the sake of a sociological debate, our sense of justice evolving in our country is not by itself a bad thing. It does, however, take us away from the solutions to crime. Our sense of justice in the past was more of a deterrent to crime. Many people like Dr. John Mathias of Hidden True Crime has studied and strived to understand what motivates people to commit crimes. I don't know where he stands on the topic, but I believe that understanding why people commit crimes leads us as a society to excuse them for it. Some believe going easy on them, maybe giving them a second chance, maybe more just for the perpetrators, but in my experience, letting them off easy just leads to more crime. Freeing perpetrators to commit more crimes doesn't help rehabilitate them. It just reinforces bad behavior. Think of it this way. In the Old West, if you committed a crime, you were charged, tried, and punished quickly. If you were convicted of murder, you were more than likely hanged in the town square the next day while everyone watched. However you feel about that, it is more of a deterrent to crime. Increasingly, the state of Idaho just passed a law allowing the use of a firing squad in death penalty cases in the event the drugs used in lethal injection are unavailable. Whatever your position on the death penalty, at least Idaho is trying to promote justice. It has been 11 years since Idaho put anyone to death, though, and plenty of time is allowed for appeals. So, I think, at least in regard to the death penalty, Idaho is struggling to find the best way to protect the public and also promote closure for not only the victims, but also the person convicted of the crime that put him or her in a position to receive the death penalty. It's a controversial subject for sure, and during the trial, I was kind of glad I wasn't put in that position to have to come to terms with it personally. Somehow my mind wouldn't let me off that easily. It's one of those lingering thoughts I keep having since the trial ended. One of the unanswered questions: is it better to put someone like Lori Daybell to death? Is it more just? Would it be easier for her to have been given a death sentence? Would it cause her to more quickly come to terms with what she did? Would it have forced her to ask for forgiveness? Or might it be more like revenge? Should revenge be part of the conversation? I would bet that the living victims would like it to be. Is the death penalty more of a deterrent to would-be criminals? This question I can answer for myself. Yes, it would be more of a deterrent. It's hardwired into us not to want to die. Even people like Lori Daybell, who think they want to die in order to get to heaven faster, when confronted with their death, will do anything to keep it from happening. So while I don't think it would have been easier for her to have received a death sentence in that regard, I do think she might suffer a lot for as long as she does live. Anyway, after going around and around in my mind, I've come to the conclusion that I can live with it. It's just one person's opinion, and I respect your right to have a differing opinion if you do. My opinion is that doing away with the death penalty, and I might as well throw hard labor in too, and guaranteeing food, shelter, and a bed to people who commit heinous crimes like murder cause more harm than getting tough on them. I think that swift and severe justice in the case of murderers and hard labor for lesser offenses, while harder on the people who commit those crimes, would be more of a deterrent and in effect cause there to be fewer perpetrators of crime and fewer victims for the perpetrators. The arguments against this, of course, are that we are likely to commit people to death wrongfully, possibly putting someone to death who is actually innocent, or that we simple humans don't have the right to take someone's life no matter what the reason. Putting someone to death mistakenly is horrible, of course. I don't think it has happened very often. I think most of the time when it does happen, we aren't talking about squeaky clean, totally innocent people, although I'm sure someone can come up with an instance where that is exactly what did happen. As far as whether or not we humans have the right or the wherewithal to commit someone to death, I think we as a society have to make some tough decisions about that. Do we take on that responsibility in the hope that we have a more civilized society, or does it make us less civilized? I could go on and possibly make you even angrier with me, but I'm just saying these are the questions I'm confronted with, and I think our country hasn't answered them satisfactorily yet. The Chad Daybell case will be a death penalty case, and the jurors will have to sentence him, not the judge. In death penalty cases in Idaho, it's up to the jury, and if the jury convicts the defendant, it goes back to the jury for sentencing. I empathize with them. This will be a heavy burden to place on them. I think it will be a bigger responsibility for them than we think. And I think that if they do sentence him to death, it will have a lasting effect on those jurors. Even as I write this book, my mind looks to the Chad Daybell trial. I'll be watching it closely, and I plan to write a sequel to this book about that trial when it's over. At the end of this, I give you a link to my website where you can keep up on my progress and get information leading up to my publishing the sequel. Idaho has had the death penalty since 1864 when it was still a territory, except for 1973 to 1976 when it was banned nationally by the Supreme Court. There have been 29 death penalty executions in Idaho since 1864, so it's pretty rare. Death by hanging was one of the methods until 1957. It's lethal injection currently with the firing squad as a backup. The Idaho legislature has set aside $750,000 to implement the firing squad. I thought a few sandbags and a heart-shaped target would do, but as we all know, the government thinks differently. There are currently 8 men and 1 woman on death row in Idaho. Idaho's last execution took place in 2012. If you visit the now vacated Idaho Penitentiary just a mile or so east of the Ada County Courthouse, you can still see the gallows that were in use until 1957. And folks, if you look back on this channel's list, I took the race through that old penitentiary, if many of y'all remember that. So if you're interested and you haven't seen it, it's somewhere on there. It's way back, though. The old Idaho pen is made of stone quarried from the surrounding hills by inmates. There's a woman's block inside the prison, and it, like the rest of the prison, is pretty bleak. Nothing but cold stone and steel. This alone could be more of a deterrent to crime than the prisons we have now. Not that the prisons we have now are all that great, but they are certainly better than what we had in the times of the old Idaho pen. Do we have equal justice under the law? Is justice meted out equally in spite of one's position? Well, I'll tell you, the system did not seem to be broken to me here in Boise, Idaho. Yeah, we would all like to see more of a punishment for Lori Daybell, but justice doesn't work that way. It's limited in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons, as I think it should be. Revenge is not a part of it. However, seeing justice work firsthand as I did as a juror, I have to say I was proud of what I saw. Let's start with the prosecution. The case was circumstantial. There's almost no direct evidence Lori Daybell murdered anyone. In fact, the only direct evidence the prosecution had positively placed her at the scene of the crime was a piece of her hair between the plastic bag and the duct tape of JJ's exhumed body. The prosecution spent a lot of time on this. According to Keely Coleman, the DNA analyst who testified in court, the chances of the hair belonging to anyone but Lori Daybell were 1 in 71 billion. They had Lori Daybell's DNA on JJ's body. The only problem with that, to me, was Lori Daybell is his mom, and a mom's hair tends to be everywhere. So they did not prove that one thing to me. In fact, I thought it would be surprising if her hair wasn't present somewhere on his body. When I interviewed the prosecution team after sentencing, I asked them about Lori Daybell's hair found on JJ. They said they debated whether or not to use that particular piece of evidence for just that reason. Of course, they came to the conclusion that they had to use it. How did they prove this case? How did they get a guilty verdict on all charges? Like skilled masons, they built their case stone by stone, carefully placing each piece. Y'all, that's Opie, and he's going to bark, so y'all just have to deal with it. Simply put, they provided enough circumstantial evidence that all added up to one possible conclusion. The standard definition of circumstantial evidence is like human footprints in the sand. You don't see the person, but you know they've been there. Lori Daybell wasn't just aware they had been murdered. She wasn't just lying to the police to protect her brother, herself, and Chad Daybell. She had her children murdered. She caused her children to be murdered. She murdered her children. Hey, honey, can you take him outside real quick? I'm almost done. Come back in a little bit. I'm sorry, y'all. But I'm not going to have him running around here barking and playing with Wayne. There he goes. Pick him up, honey. I apologize to all y'all. If y'all just bear with me, this is called life. Where was I? But how could they prove it? How could they convince all 18 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt? It couldn't have been easy, and I wonder how many hours were spent preparing this case. It had to be a lot. When I asked them about that, they couldn't tell me because they didn't know. A lot of long days and too many hours to possibly count. Chapter 5, the media. What role did the media play in this case? Is the mortar that holds everything together? If the mortar rots and falls away, the whole foundation of our country is going to end up just a dusty pile of rubble. There's been a ton of exposure since the very beginning when Kay and Larry Woodcock started asking questions. Two guys have been on this story since the beginning, Nate Eaton and Justin Lum. Nate Eaton is a reporter for EastIdahoNews.com, a website he helped to launch in 2015. He is a four-time recipient of the prestigious Edward R. Murrow Award and has been the winner of many other journalistic awards. He's covered numerous national stories, including the Virginia Tech Massacre and presidential candidates. Justin Lum is a reporter from Phoenix, Arizona. He helped launch Fox 10 Investigates Missing in Arizona, which is a series to shed light on missing persons cases across Arizona, especially missing people of color who, as he says, are marginalized by national media. I was able to meet both of these reporters at the sentencing in Rexburg. There are literally hundreds of other reporters who have covered this case, but these two have covered it from beginning to end and are still covering it. Nate Eaton was hovering over Chad Daybell's yard in a helicopter when the bodies of JJ and Tylee were found. His helicopter followed Chad Daybell's car when he fled the scene, chased by police. He was there every day of Lori Daybell's trial. Justin Lum was there for a lot of it, traveling all the way from Arizona. But what role did they play? Media has a huge influence over the minds of the American people. We all want to know what is going on from day to day, and we get our news from many different sources: TV, podcasts, YouTube, Facebook, X, which is formerly Twitter, etc. I don't watch a lot of local news, but as I studied the people in the gallery, Nate Eaton's face did seem familiar to me. I had probably seen him on one of the national news networks at some point. The news we get can set in motion a tide of sentiment that can influence an investigation. People held vigils and put together monuments of flowers and cards on Chad Daybell's property while JJ and Tylee were missing. People still believed in Chad Daybell, even though he was thought by police to have a role in the case of the missing children. I guess they wanted to believe and hope for the best. And I don't think at that point, before the bodies were found or Tammy's death had been determined to be murder, anyone would have guessed the truth. It was just too gruesome, and things like that just didn't happen in places like Rexburg, Idaho. The people in the media did everything they could to help in the search for JJ and Tylee. Billboards were put up along the highways, rewards were offered for information, and it was all over the news for months, even years. Bloggers blogged and tweeters tweeted. The frustration showed in what people in the media were saying. Nate Eaton asked Lori Daybell directly where her kids were and got no answer. You can watch him on EastIdahoNews.com describing his experience watching the trial, and I think you'll get a feeling for what everyone in that courtroom had to go through. Eaton talks about Larry Woodcock sobbing as Rexburg Detective Ray Hermosillo describes his experience exhuming the bodies of JJ and Tylee. He talks about it being the first time he witnessed Lori Daybell show any emotion was when they showed us the photos of JJ and Tylee's exhumed bodies, or in Tylee's case, what was left of it. Lori Daybell appeared to be crying then. Eaton also talks about the 18 jurors who just days before had no idea they would be called into court to listen and see stuff that will probably never leave them. I have more to say about that in upcoming chapters, but I will say here that Eaton was right. I could see what was coming that day as I sat in court, and we had been forewarned it would be awful. We were handed boxes of tissues and barf bags ahead of going into the courtroom. Knowing what was coming, I prepared myself. I understand why the prosecution needed to show the pictures, but I didn't feel like I needed to see them. I told myself that I would take a quick glance at whatever it was they were going to show us and look away as quickly as possible. Well, I did that. I bet it was milliseconds I spent actually looking at each picture, but it was just too much. Those pictures are burned into my mind, and I don't think they'll ever go away or ever become fuzzy. It's weird to me because I can study something for a long time and have a hard time remembering details about it, but I can see every detail of JJ's exhumed body after the shortest glance possible. After the detectives cut away all the plastic and duct tape, we could see JJ still in his red pajamas. He had been wearing the red fire truck pajamas when we last saw him alive, sitting on the couch in Lori Daybell's apartment. As I write about it, I have to look over the top of my computer where I placed a picture of JJ and Tylee when they were still alive. They speak to me. They tell me I need to write their story. They tell me I can tell their story. Dreams being dreams, I can say I've had one that featured the images of JJ and Tylee's exhumed bodies, and I hope I never do. I have had dreams since the trial where I felt the terror that JJ and Tylee must have felt. There was a lot of other media in the courtroom every day besides just Nate Eaton and Justin Lum. Some would come and go, and some were there for most of the trial. A few times I noticed people who I had to assume were probably either doing a televised newscast in front of the courthouse before the trial began for the day, or who would be after. I'm not sure if it was makeup or just the way they were dressed and how perfect their appearance was, but they looked like someone you would see on the evening news. Others, I think, were bloggers. I'm not big on social media, so I wouldn't have known for sure at the time. I've since gotten to know Lauren Mathias of Hidden True Crime and Gigi McKelvey of Pretty Lies and Alibis. These women are legitimate investigative reporters and have a ton of knowledge about this case. When I first talked to them after the trial was over, I didn't know what I didn't know, and the information they shared with me helped me get started. What I can say for sure is that I could hear the clacking of fingers on keyboards as the trial went along. I also heard more than one cell phone ring during court, which was a big no-no. Whenever that would happen, Judge Boyce would stop everything and a guard would take the phone away and set it outside the door of the courtroom. I thought that people having their phone turned on in court was really low class and reminded me of middle school behavior. I was surprised Judge Boyce put up with it at all because it was really disruptive. A gavel may have been handy in those situations. The media was not allowed in the courtroom at all during jury selection. There was an overflow room where they could watch the trial through a closed-circuit TV. According to News Nation, the feed was cut off whenever a juror was directly questioned. Frustrating for the media, I'm sure, but I think there was a lot of concern about having to sequester the jury, and I'm extremely grateful that the court did everything they could not to have to do that to us. As jurors, we weren't even allowed to talk to each other about the case. And I have to say, a lot of the time, I felt like I was back in math class trying to follow the instructor. Somehow, though, just like in math class, it all came together by the end of the trial. A few times, jurors would be sitting in the jury room talking about someone in the gallery or something of interest that happened, but didn't really have anything to do with the case. If our guard, Steve, happened to overhear our conversation, he would remind us that we were not to talk about the case. I know he did that for our benefit and for the sake of the trial. If someone in the hall overheard and misinterpreted what we were saying, it could have caused us to be sequestered. Being sequestered is the last thing I wanted. It would have been an extreme hardship, and it was hard enough as it was. Being sequestered would mean 5 weeks of being totally isolated from anyone not on the jury, spending nights in a hotel and eating takeout until we reached a verdict. It's interesting to me watching news about the trial now that it's over. Many in the media admit how hard it was to follow. Lauren Matthias discussed how she and other journalists would talk to each other during a break and try to work through the testimony they heard. She says it was very difficult to comprehend it all, and talking to each other helped them to make sense of it all. All the media people I mentioned above have been very generous with their time, and I couldn't have written this book without the information that they shared with me. If you search Lori Daybell or Chad Daybell, you will find more information about the case than you could ever read or listen to. In addition, you can watch it on Dateline NBC, 48 Hours, or Netflix. I'm sure there are plenty of other places to get information. I would think that for true crime enthusiasts, it would be just about the most intriguing case to learn about. In addition to being a juror, I have taken a deep dive into the case. I've learned a lot that we weren't allowed to know as jurors, but I still have a lot of unanswered questions. Chapter 6, Back to Court, the Prosecution. You might think prosecuting Lori Daybell would be easy. After all, the whole world was watching this case, assuming she was guilty. Everyone was angry with her for murdering her children. People watched the police make statements on TV after the children's bodies were exhumed. She had lied to the police for months, saying the children were okay. So much was known about this case. The facts remain, though, the prosecution provided almost no direct evidence tying Lori Daybell to the murders. So how did they prove their case? Fremont County Prosecutor Lindsay Blake graduated from Idaho State University in 2005 and the University of Utah Quinley College of Law in 2007. She says her grandfather encouraged her to become a lawyer. She served 6 years as a public defender in Bannock County, Idaho, before becoming a Fremont County prosecutor. She'd been involved in 2 murder cases before even taking this case, so she had some experience, but would it be enough for this case of this magnitude? I'm sure there were other prosecutors with more experience, but Lindsay Blake is not just any prosecutor. In fact, I think what best qualified her is the fact that she spent her whole life in Idaho, other than a few years in Utah and Wyoming. She's a local woman. Obviously, she could have gone anywhere given her qualifications and experience. She could be making a lot more money, I'm sure, if she were willing to leave Idaho, but she has chosen to stay here. I had the opportunity to meet and interview Mrs. Blake after the sentencing. She also had a few questions for me and wanted a juror's input on how her team might have done better. They got guilty verdicts on all counts, so it's hard to criticize what they presented to the jury in court. I did say that I thought they could have outlined the case for us better at the beginning because I felt very much behind the curve most of the time. It did all come together by the end, though, and listening back to the transcripts of the trial, I see that they did outline the case pretty well. I just think that being so ignorant of the case, I wasn't given enough time for it to sink in. As one of the 2 lead prosecutors in the case, Lindsay Blake made the opening statement in court. To me, she seemed immediately likable, honest, and professional, someone who you wanted to believe. She didn't seem overly forceful or pushy, although she did strike me as a very determined person. She said this case was about money, power, and sex, and she and her team would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lori Daybell was guilty of 2 counts of murder, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of grand theft. In his closing argument, Madison County Prosecutor Rob Wood reiterated Lindsay Blake's opening statement, saying, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell set in motion a chain of disturbing events that included several deaths. Along the way, they included her brother Alex to participate in a conspiracy unencumbered and free of obstacles. This plan was driven by Lori Vallow's desire and the use of money, power, and sex, and this plan must end today in the verdicts you render in this trial. Early on, Blake and Wood determined they needed someone on their team with more experience in murder trials. They brought Rachel Smith onto the team. Smith is a 28-year veteran prosecutor from Missouri, having prosecuted every type of criminal case. She graduated from Washington College and Washington School of Law in 1992. She is the founder of Smith Law and Consulting and assists prosecutors nationwide. While Smith was the most experienced prosecuting attorney in the case, I could not have expected that from my observations of her while I would not have expected that from my observations of her while I was sitting on the jury. She seemed less organized than Blake or Wood, not to say she wasn't very effective. All 3 prosecutors were very effective, but Smith always seemed to have more difficulty with the technology. She couldn't get the overhead projector to work when she wanted it to, and things like that. In her defense, I'll say I was kind of taken aback by how dysfunctional the technology was in the courtroom. One would think for such an important case, something as simple as projecting a document or picture onto a screen so the jury could see it, or having a laser pointer for a witness to use with good batteries, would be worked out ahead of time. It is Idaho, however, and I would bet that other states where Smith prosecuted cases are more up to date. I might lose that bet because my sister, who is an attorney in California, the home of Silicon Valley, said, nope, courtroom technology is way out of date even here. However, she came off in court when I interviewed Smith after the sentencing. I found her to be extremely focused and to the point. She definitely knew her stuff and was a confident and competent prosecutor. It seems to me that good attorneys have their own demeanor or personality in court that is singularly theirs. She had that, and to me she came off as kind of a simple down-home type of person, and it worked well for her, even though I think she was anything but that. When I asked the team if this case had affected them in their personal lives, Rob Wood's reply was, how could it not? Not only were their professional and personal lives overtaken by the enormity of the case, but they also had other cases going on, and they couldn't just let them sit idle while they worked on this one. It seemed to me that the point was that their professional lives had overrun their personal lives, and their personal lives had suffered. And they still had the Chad Daybell case coming up. It will be mostly the same prosecution team, and Judge Boyce will be the judge. The team's most experienced prosecutor, Rachel Smith, left the prosecution team in February of 2024, just 2 months before the Chad Daybell trial started. After the trial, I learned that a typical workday for the team was 16 to 17 hours long. They burned a lot of midnight oil and considered themselves night owls. When I asked if they would hold anything back for the Chad Daybell trial, they said it won't be the same trial. I was curious what they looked for when selecting jurors. Was there a particular profile? They said they just wanted confident, intellectual people who would be able to follow what was presented in court. I can sure understand that because it was super hard to follow it all. I thought their answer was interesting when I asked how confident they were in getting guilty verdicts. They said they were confident but didn't want to take any chances because it only takes one juror to cause a mistrial. I wasn't surprised by this. They'd gone over things so thoroughly throughout the trial, at times it got monotonous. But I understood why they had to present the same argument in different ways. During the trial, while questioning witnesses, I got the feeling the prosecution was asking them questions they knew the defense would ask in cross-examination. In other words, preempting the questions. I thought that was a good strategy, and they admitted to doing that, and in fact, seemed pleased that I noticed. I actually felt like the prosecution took the voice away from the defense in that regard. They were that thorough in their questions of the witnesses. Sorry, y'all. So back to how they proved their case. As we know, all the evidence except one hair found on JJ's body was circumstantial. How do you prove Lori Daybell, who wasn't proven to be at any of the murder scenes at the time of the murders, actually committed those murders? When you look at it that way, you can see why it might be hard to prove. If she wasn't even there, how could she be guilty of murder? Conspiracy to commit murder, maybe, but murder? In Idaho, if you conspire to commit murder, you can be charged and convicted of murder, even if you didn't actually do the stabbing, the choking, the shooting, or whatever it was that caused the death of your victim. What the prosecution really needed to prove was that Lori Daybell conspired to commit the murders of her children and of Tammy Daybell. I thought, after hearing 60 witnesses called by the prosecution, Lori Daybell was certainly guilty. Here's a summary of the facts presented to the jury. She lied multiple times to police. Police found items used in the murders and attempted murders in her apartment and storage unit. Her hair was found on JJ's body. Police found multiple texts and emails referring to the murders, but not explicitly. All four of the victims, I'm including Charles, even though she hasn't been convicted of that one yet, were said to have been dark by Chad and Lori Daybell, and being dark meant you had to die to cast out the zombies. There was a bullet embedded in the floor beneath Charles's body. The bodies of her children were found buried in her husband's backyard. Lori never lived at Chad's house. She was arrested in Hawaii. The children had been bound and burned in a manner she had described as the method used to cast out zombies. It's all circumstantial for sure. Any one of those things by itself probably would not have been enough to convict her, but taken all together, there is no other conclusion one could come to. So again, stone by stone, the prosecution carefully built the foundation of their case, fitting each piece together to make sure it was strong and would withstand whatever forces the defense might use to topple it. I asked the team why they didn't seek the death penalty. After all, as of now, they are seeking death in the Chad Daybell case, and he is charged with the same crimes. The prosecution team told me the judge thought that at some point in their preparations for this case, they didn't disclose evidence and discovery to the defense in a timely manner, so he took the death penalty off the table. Discovery just means the defense asking for and the prosecution sharing with the defense any evidence they had against the defendant. They're required to share all evidence with the defense, and they aren't supposed to hold on to it for any length of time. The prosecution isn't allowed any surprises. I can sure see how the defense could make the argument that the prosecution didn't share evidence in a timely manner, and I can see why the judge would go along with it. Not handing over evidence immediately could have easily happened in this case, or at least the defense could win an argument that it happened. The prosecution team was working so hard and so many hours, interviewing so many witnesses and getting so much new information from them, it would have been easy for the defense to say they didn't share some of the evidence they were getting. How could you prove that argument wrong if it were not true? So my thought is that Judge Boyce allowed the defense to win that argument just to be fair as he possibly could be. I did find out later, while having a conversation about a completely different matter with a private investigator, that the defense had hired him to help get the death penalty off the table. He wouldn't tell me what that was all about, or if they came up with some information that helped Judge Boyce make the decision. When I asked the prosecution team if they thought anyone besides Lori and Chad Daybell or Alex Cox knew Tylee and JJ were dead before their bodies were found, they said they couldn't speculate on that because of the upcoming Chad Daybell trial. They said the same thing when I asked if they thought either Alex Cox or Joe Ryan had been murdered. Very interesting, huh, y'all? Chapter 7, the defense. I think this would be a good point in the book to take you back to what I experienced in court and give more detail about witnesses and their testimony. What about the defense team? Were their hearts in it, or did they have an impossible client? As I said before, there were 60 witnesses for the prosecution, none for the defense. Some of the finest words I ever heard were when Jim Archibald said the defense rest. This after having called not one witness. His actual words were, "Your Honor, we don't believe the state has proven its case, so the defense will rest." For some reason, his voice saying those words are burned into my mind. Maybe it was just such a relief to hear it after all we had to strive to understand for so long. Most of the cross-examination by the defense was done by John Thomas, a Bonneville County public defender who was appointed by Judge Boyce. Mr. Thomas joined the defense team in April of 2022 after Lori Daybell's attorney, Mark Means, was disqualified by Judge Boyce because of a potential conflict of interest. Mr. Thomas had the appearance of someone you would trust and experience with trying high-profile cases. In a TCU, Texas Christian University article by Lisa Martin, she says, like a real-life Atticus Finch, John Thomas worked 10 years to free an innocent man convicted of murder and rape. He won the man's release in March of 2017. According to Jordan Crane, public defender in Bonneville County, Idaho, and John Thomas's boss, what's really amazing about this whole case is how John never gave up, even in spite of his setbacks. It didn't sit well with him that an innocent man was in prison. I cannot even imagine the amount of personal time he spent working to free Chris Tapp. That's impressive and makes Mr. Thomas someone I would definitely want defending me. I can't think of a higher compliment for an attorney than being compared to Harper Lee's character, Atticus Finch, in the book To Kill a Mockingbird. My apologies to Mr. Thomas, but as an aside, I feel like I have to mention my sister here. She is an attorney and generously offered to help edit and clarify my writings of this book. She has been immensely helpful, and in fact, I think may have saved me from making some really dreadful mistakes in my explanations of the law. She never told me this before, but when she read this, she commented that Atticus Finch was the sole inspiration for her in becoming an attorney. Thomas was on the swim team at TCU and was all-conference in 1991. In fact, in court, he mentioned being a diver in college. I wasn't sure at the time why he brought that up. Thinking about it now, I wonder if there was some insecurity on the part of the defense team having to represent Lori Daybell. I certainly would understand that, but I felt like they were good people doing their jobs the best way that they could. I have a lot of respect for those guys and the work they had to do. Solid and sincere, Mr. Archibald and Mr. Thomas had worked together before, and Mr. Thomas had prior experience in high-profile cases. Jim Archibald, the other defense attorney, had been an attorney since 1991 and had tried 85 jury trials. He'd worked with Mr. Thomas before. As a public defender, Mr. Archibald was appointed to this case by Judge Boyce after Lori Daybell was declared indigent. To me, he had the look of a defense attorney. distinctive with a graying beard that seemed to show experience, and a voice that carried well in court and was way easy to listen to. According to Nate Eaton at EastIdahoNews.com, quote, Jim Archibald is a seasoned attorney who has represented several high-profile clients in death penalty cases, unquote. He is one of only 2 death penalty certified public defenders in Idaho. He also has a private practice as a defense attorney, and interestingly, it's also a family law attorney. I guess in small town Idaho, you need to be a jack of all trades, or maybe Mr. Archibald takes those two things very seriously and focuses on them because there's a need for him to do so. In 2019, the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the state of Idaho, claiming that public defenders are overworked and unable to adequately defend their clients. This would make money a factor in the outcomes of cases where public defenders were used by their clients. If a defendant was unable to afford to hire his or her own attorney and had to use a public defender, the public defender wouldn't have the time needed to mount a proper defense. Jim Archibald testified for the ACLU, agreeing with their argument. Since there were around 900 pending cases in Idaho, it seems like a strong argument. Right before the sentencing, I happened to cross paths with Mr. Archibald on our way into the courtroom. He took the time to stop and shake my hand and thank me for my jury service. I thought that was very nice of him. So it looked like even though Lori Daybell couldn't afford to hire her own defense team, and in spite of the ACLU's claim against the state of Idaho, she definitely had 2 very qualified public defenders on her side. I think it was a victory for the defense just to get the death penalty taken off the table. I'm not sure what his purpose was, but when cross-examining witnesses during the trial, Mr. Thomas would spend most of his time asking mundane questions. Of course, I understand it's important to know the background of a witness to establish their credibility, but Mr. Thomas didn't really go much further than that while cross-examining most witnesses. There was one exciting moment when Jim Archibald cross-examined prosecution witness Audrey Baratario, Lori Daybell's former friend. Baratario claimed that in October of 2019, she had questioned Lori Daybell about where the kids were, and in response, Lori Daybell threatened her, saying she would cut me up and bury me in a place where no one would find me. Lori Daybell called her naive and laughed at her. Lori Daybell said, "You're so naive and trusting. You're like a child. You think the world is all unicorns and rainbows. You go around helping people and serving them. Well, I've got news for you. Not everyone is a good person, and not everyone can be so kind." Audrey went on to say on the witness stand, she said she would cut me up and was in the mental place to do it, but would get herself in a place to do it, and there'd be blood and bleach and something about trash bags. In his cross-examination in a raised voice, Mr. Archibald asked her, "You want the jury to believe that you didn't make this last crap up?" Finally, I thought, the defense was putting up a fight. It was short-lived, but it did, however, serve to put the question in my mind, could Audrey have been making it all up? After all, the witnesses who had been friends with Lori Vallow or fellow preppers were not the kind of people I would take too seriously. When asked by Archibald why she had not brought any of this up until now and not said anything in her testimony to the grand jury, Audrey said she had been so scared. So apparently her testimony took the defense team by surprise. I guess Lori Daybell's powers had been neutralized enough in Audrey's mind by that point. Audrey is talking even more about what she knows now that Lori Daybell is in prison, and she now says she heard Lori Daybell say she listened to someone taking their last breath. Wow, y'all. I didn't know that one. Maybe y'all knew about it, but Audrey Bartell, after Lori was sentenced and everything, saying that Lori listened to someone taking their last breath. Audrey thinks Lori Daybell was talking about Joe Ryan, who allegedly died of natural causes in 2018. Lori Daybell was not supposed to have been there when he died. Was she there? Did she murder him? What was Lori Daybell's defense? What tactics did the defense team use to try to get a not guilty verdict in the case? It seemed to me the defense's main point was that the prosecution wasn't sure what Lori Daybell was guilty of. Did she directly participate in the murders? Did she compel others to commit the murders? Did she advise, encourage, or command others to commit the murders? If the prosecution wasn't sure which of these were true, how could they expect the jury to convict her beyond a reasonable doubt? I think this is equivalent to a quote that I think all defense and prosecution attorneys are familiar with. It goes something like this. If the facts are on your side, argue the facts. If the facts aren't on your side, argue the law. If neither the facts nor the law are on your side, pound the table. We listened as Rexburg Detective Ray Hermosillo spent a lot of time on the witness stand describing the exhumation of JJ and Tylee and the autopsies of their bodies in great detail. He also described items found in Lori Daybell's apartment. They found several rifles and handguns, 2 silencers, army knives, hazmat suits, and a ghillie suit. A ghillie suit is a camouflage outfit designed to resemble whatever the background environment is. It would typically have weeds and leaves or things like that attached to it. Hunters and soldiers use it to blend into their surroundings. We listened as Rexburg Detective Chuck Kusanis described how he had found a receipt for a storage unit during the search of Lori Daybell's apartment. When you're sitting in the jury box listening to witnesses, you tend to size them up. Are they believable? Are they credible witnesses? You watch their body language as they speak. Make judgments on their character. Are they believable? Do they have anything to hide? Do they have something to gain by lying? Detective Consanis is a huge guy. He towers over everyone. He looks extremely uncomfortable being in a courtroom in a suit and tie. My guess was he was a guy who would rather be outside somewhere. I could relate to that and sympathize with him for having to be in the spotlight. As I sat there listening to him testify, my sense was that he was very sincere and completely believable. He wouldn't do the things he had to do, like testify in court, if he wasn't. I got the opportunity to have a conversation with him at the sentencing, and my impression of him was reinforced. On the witness stand in court, he talked a lot about the items found in Lori Daybell's storage unit. They found bikes, a scooter, children's winter clothes, a backpack with JJ's initials, photo albums of Tylee and JJ, and other items related to the children. They also had surveillance footage of someone bringing in a spare tire and a back seat, very likely taken out of Tylee's Jeep in preparation of Alex's alleged attempted shooting of Brandon Boudreaux in Arizona. Since, as Detective Consatis testified, the back window could not be opened without the spare tire being removed. In his cross-examination of Detective Hermosillo, John Thomas asked him if he knew whether any of the guns and military gear were owned by Lori Daybell, and the detective's answer was no. This showed a lack of any evidence that directly tied Lori Daybell to the murders. When asked where Lori Vallow was at the time of Tammy's murder, the answer was that Lori Vallow was in Hawaii, nowhere near Tammy. And Lori Daybell was in her apartment when JJ and Tylee were killed, not at Alex's apartment or Chad Daybell's house. We're not sure where JJ was murdered. It could have been in Lori's apartment while she was there. It could have been in her bedroom while she was in it. JJ may have been dead when Alex carried him on his shoulder upstairs. Were the timeline Lori Daybell's lies and what she had said to people like Audrey enough for a jury to convict her? Remember, she was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Idaho law states she did not have to be present at the murder scenes at the time of the murders to be guilty of first-degree murder. Remember also, according to Judge Boyce's instructions to the jury, she can be found guilty of first-degree murder if the jury finds she conspired, encouraged, or compelled others to do the actual murdering. This, to me, actually made the witnesses who were associated with Lori Daybell more important than all of the detectives, FBI agents, medical examiners, etc. In other words, the testimony of a lot of flaky prepper-type people, many of whom led questionable lives, had to hold more weight than all the forensic evidence and all the guns and bodies, duct tape, etc., presented by extremely qualified, extremely believable professional people. Wow. I hate to even say that, but it's true. I never found myself questioning whether J.J., Tylee, Tammy, or Charles was brutally murdered. I 100% believed all of the testimony given by the law enforcement witnesses for the prosecution. But the real question was, did Lori Daybell do it? And none of the evidence provided by those witnesses proved that. In my mind, not even Lori Daybell's DNA between the duct tape and plastic bag found on JJ proved that she was there when he was murdered. What did prove to me she was guilty? The mountain of circumstantial evidence. In Tammy Daybell's case, Lori Daybell was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Tammy died on October 19th of 2019. No autopsy was performed at the time, as the local coroner determined she died in her sleep of natural causes. A coroner is not the same as a medical examiner, something I had not thought of until it was explained in court. A coroner is an elected official and doesn't even need to have a law enforcement or medical background. A medical examiner is completely different. A medical examiner is a licensed doctor and pathologist. Dr. Eric Christensen performed the autopsy on Tammy after she was exhumed on December 11th of 2019, almost 2 months after she was buried. Dr. Christensen is the chief medical examiner at the Utah Department of Health and had 14 years of experience besides medical school and plenty of other training. Testifying in court, Dr. Christensen showed us pictures of Tammy's exhumed body. It surprised me that her body looked similar to the pictures we saw from the morning she died. Dr. Christensen explained how the bruising on her arms shown in the pictures had to have happened close to the time of her death, indicating she had been held down at the time of her death. He told us about how he was able to take cross sections of the bruised tissue and estimate when the bruising occurred. If it happened after she died, she would have had no blood pressure, so there would be little to no bruising. If it had happened much before her death, there would have been more healing. Honestly, it was a little hard to follow, but that was the gist of it. We had previously seen pictures of Tammy in her bed the morning after the night she died. In those pictures, we could see pink frothy foam coming out of her mouth. The coroner thought it was caused by some kind of pneumonia or some other lung illness. This would be consistent with what Chad Daybell was telling the police, but Dr. Christensen explained it was consistent with asphyxiation. Cammie Wilmore, a Fremont County advanced EMT and deputy coroner, also testified about Tammy's death. She was on call that morning and was the coroner called in to Chad and Tammy's house that morning Tammy died. She testified that Tammy's body was already cold, even though Chad Daybell stated she died that morning. She also mentioned the pink frothy foam coming out of Tammy's mouth, saying, "Quite a bit of foam," and that was odd, but she said she thought it could be congestive heart failure or something similar to that. Even though she was a deputy coroner as well as an advanced EMT, she didn't have much experience with determining a cause of death, and she said she had never seen foam like that. Wilmore was not aware of the disappearance of JJ and Tylee at this point, and said she had no reason at the time to suspect foul play in Tammy's death. Remember also, this took place in the very small community of Rexburg, Idaho. Most people there are Mormon and go to the Mormon church, so most people there know each other, or at least know of each other. They know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, or so they may have thought. Now, let me just stop there real quick. Yeah, they like to judge people. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And I guarantee you, the good ones are only Mormons, and everyone else, no matter what their religion, non-religion, whatever, they're the bad guys. You get it? I did have to wonder about Chad and Tammy Daybell's son, Garth, and their 4 other children. Garth was there the morning of Tammy's death, and I'm told supports his father to this day. He also seems to be suspicious of the police and prosecution. I wonder if Garth will testify in Chad Daybell's trial. I'm getting the sense that at least one of Chad and Tammy's kids will testify. It feels like John Pryor is setting that up. In his cross-examination of Lori Daybell's former best friend, Melanie Gibb, John Thomas asked her about the castings she and Lori Daybell participated in to remove dark spirits from the body. He asked her if the disconnecting of cords or convincing the spirits to leave the body was all done with prayer, and she answered yes. The prosecution had established that the casting of spirits from the body was Lori Daybell's justification for killing J.J. and Tylee. So by asking Gibb this, the defense was trying to weaken the prosecution's foundation. Mr. Thomas asked Gibb if she thought it would mean people would die, and she said no. Of course she's going to say no. Of course Melanie Gibb's going to say no. She ain't going to say, yeah, that's a way for us to get ready to kill them. My thought was, of course, Gibb didn't think at that time that anyone was in danger of dying, but I think Mr. Thomas's point was that this whole idea of casting and zombies was harmless, weird maybe, but not deadly. And you know what, y'all? Y'all know how I feel about Melanie Gibb, so I'm just going to keep, you just know, I mean, I could cuss that out right there, but I'm not going to. We'll just move forward. Let's get to Zulema. Zulema was another member of Chad and Lori Daybell's inner circle. She followed Chad and Lori Daybell, thoroughly believed in them. Okay, so here we go. I don't know if he's trying to say that Gibb was one. He doesn't say, come right out and say it, but he says Zulema was another member of Chad and Lori Daybell's inner circle, so he implies it. She followed Chad and Lori Daybell and thoroughly believed in them. She even married Lori Daybell's brother Alex when Chad told her he had a vision that she was to do so. In his cross-examination of Zulema, I think defense attorney John Thomas did his best to discredit her. He asked her about her spiritual beliefs. She told him in the court that she had visions on December 4th of 2018. Prosecutor Smith objected, but Zulema was allowed by Judge Boyce to continue. About her visions, she said, I remember myself in a beautiful room with a very large table with children. There was a godlike being at the head of the table. God, y'all. It seemed to me that Mr. Thomas was trying to discredit her as a witness by showing that Chad Daybell's influence over her was very strong, that she must be gullible and malleable, that she at least was capable of believing impossible things. Mr. Thomas also asked her about the castings, if they were done spiritually and not physically. She replied that at the time she thought they were being done spiritually, but that she thinks now that the castings led to Tylee and JJ's deaths. I think Mr. Thomas's point, though, was that one can't just assume that someone's involvement in castings would necessarily lead to murder. At least the defense team was trying to put some doubt into the minds of the jury. I did have my misgivings about some of the witnesses called by the prosecution. I doubted their sincerity. I doubted their character, and I doubted some of what they said on the witness stand. I got the sense that some of them were more concerned with protecting themselves than they were telling the truth. I wonder if some of them might have known more than they were admitting to knowing. I did think on the whole they had their own stories down pat, not so much that they had colluded with each other, but individually they had their stories well thought out. I'd love to have seen some of them questioned more thoroughly, but I don't think that would have served the prosecution or defense. The prosecution would not have wanted to show that their witness was shaky, and the defense would not have wanted to show that they knew more than what they were admitting. If that had been exposed, it would only have strengthened the prosecution's case. As frustrating as it was, the jury had to be content with what we were allowed by both teams to hear. And that is one of the things that led me to have so many questions when the trial was over. Okay, so leave your comments on part 2. Let me know what you think. I apologize if I had some interruptions or I tripped over my own country slang. I'm doing the best I can. I love you all. We'll get back soon with part 3. And I love you all. Keep on looking.